Please adjust the volume of the speakers so that you can hear this clearly across the room. This is a sound test. Please adjust the volume so that you can hear this clearly across the room. Welcome to the presentation on protecting pollinators in the landscape, presented by Irfan Vafai, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Program Specialist in IPM. This is a disclaimer. The speaker may, in several occasions, try to interact with the audience. Please remember, this is a pre-recording. Do not fall for his tricks. Please enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Oh, hi there. I didn't see y'all enter the room. So nice to see y'all. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I hope that this presentation could be just as engaging, if not even more, than if I were actually there in the flesh. The talk you're going to be hearing about right now is protecting pollinators in the landscape. As we know, pollinators have become more and more important. People have been starting to notice, especially with monarch butterfly populations and honeybees with their population declines. So we're going to look at not only at some of those poster childs that we refer to as these poster child pollinators, but also what are some of the other common pollinators that we have in the landscape and what you can do to help promote their populations. Now, first things first, just quick off the top, what is a pollinator? Anyone here know what a pollinator is? All right, just a reminder, if you're raising your hand right now, this is a pre-recorded presentation, so I can't actually see you raising your hand. So actually just put your hand back down very gently, and I apologize if I caused any embarrassment. A pollinator is an animal that moves pollen from the male anther of the flower to the female stigma of a flower. So I like to think of this as being a very sexy topic for this reason. All right. So what you have, so this is an example, right? In cross-pollination, we have a pollinator will go to feed sometimes on the pollen or on the nectar, okay? And as they do so, they some of this pollen accumulates, whether it be on their hairs or they might intentionally be collecting some of that pollen on their hind legs. The bee then travels to a different flower. Then the pollen on the bee sticks to the pistil of a flower on the other plant, and this causes fertilization. About 90% of flowering plants rely on animal pollinators for fertilization. This is very important to note that we're talking about flowering plants, right? So there are some of these flowering plants that are just wind pollinated. They don't need an actual animal to pollinate it. And this is referring to all animal pollinators, so not just honeybees. There are 200,000 species of animal pollinators, 1,000 of which are birds, bats, and mammals, and the rest are insects. So insects make up the vast majority of the number of pollinators in the landscape. So why do insects pollinate? So some insects are after the pollen. That pollen is a source of protein. With that protein, they can make more babies. So they need that pollen in order to expand their colony. Whereas a lot of other insects are after the nectar, which is a source of sugar. If you can think of a lot of these insects that are flying around is a very high energy cost mode of transportation. And so they need a lot of energy, and that nectar is that source of sugar for them to use. Now I'd like to cover 5 groups of insect pollinators here. And again, so within these groups, we do have some of those poster child pollinators, but we also have a lot of others that we don't really consider. So the 5 groups I'd like to cover are Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths, Hymenoptera, such as our bees and wasps, Diptera, which are our flies, Coleoptera, our beetles, and lastly, Neuroptera, which are the lacewings. So Lepidoptera, these are caterpillars of moths and butterflies. They undergo what we call complete metamorphosis. So they completely change in form from the immature to their mature forms. So they'll go from egg to larva, and they have this stage referred to as a pupa, in which they metamorphose. Essentially, they become a soup of cells that then completely reforms itself almost into a completely new organism, the adult, again being in this case a moth or a butterfly. They have specialized mouth parts for feeding on nectar in specific flowers. And so that encourages pollination between flowers of the same species. You have some flowers where the nectar source is very deep within that flower. And so not all pollinators can actually reach it unless they have a proboscis that actually can go in deep enough to actually feed on that flower. So again, this relationship has developed over time in order to encourage, only those pollinators that will then visit others, similar, the same species, essentially with different plants of the same species, so that you can get successfully pollinated. And you can have very specific host plants for caterpillars, and we'll look at a number of those because a lot of times people ask, what can I include in my garden in order to encourage pollinators? And there's obviously the source of nectar for the adults, but the caterpillars are often a little bit more host specific. So they sometimes need a specific host plant in order to develop. And I refer to these as controversial pollinators because as butterflies and moths, oftentimes they are very beautiful. They are considered desirable and organisms we try to encourage. But in their immature stages, they are damaging. They are, chewing on our plants, chewing on our vegetable garden. They're what we're often trying to control. And so there's this kind of dichotomy when it comes to pollinators, right? Like, do we want them or do we not want them? And I think the answer is we want them, but we obviously in their caterpillar stage need to find a way to manage them in a way that they're not causing more damage than we can actually handle or bear. So again, as adults, beautiful butterflies, right? And here you can see the proboscis actually reaching down off of this butterfly right into that flower to feed on that nectar source. And this, by the way, let's just go back. You can tell that the difference between a butterfly and a moth is that a moth's antennae are typically quite hairy, whereas a butterfly is kind of a straight antenna with a little bulb on the end. And that's one way of distinguishing between a butterfly and a moth adult. And then we have things like hornworms. So how many of you in here, by show of hands, have dealt with hornworms before in your gardens? Okay, yeah, just a reminder, this is a pre-recorded presentation. So if you just raised your hand, unfortunately, I can't actually see your hand. So again, I apologize if I caused any embarrassment there. But the hornworms, they cause an incredible amount of damage. I remember walking into a room one time where they were rearing a number of different insects, and in the middle of this room was this little tree pot in a large pot. And you could hear crunching noises, and you could see clumps of frass, clumps of poo, essentially on the ground. And as I approached, I came to realize they were rearing hornworms. So if you actually get a whole bunch of hornworms together, they are so large and they chew so much, they can actually hear them chew. But as adults, hornworms are beautiful. They're known as a sphinx moth or a hawk moth. You can see here it actually mimics a hummingbird in many ways. So it actually, the frequency at which it beats its wings are incredibly fast, just like a hummingbird. And it hovers in front of the flower and feeds on the nectar. So instead of actually landing on the plant and feeding, it is just hovering in front of those flowers and feeding. It's an absolutely beautiful moth if you've ever seen it. And so again, if we're controlling all of the hornworms, we lose all of our sphinx moths and our hawk moths. Again, proving my point that these are very controversial pollinators. All right, so now we have a number of other beautiful, now this is the poster child, right? This is the monarch butterfly caterpillar that feeds very specifically on milkweed plants. And here's the chrysalis or the pupa of that caterpillar once it's trying to metamorphose into an adult. And we've all seen monarch butterfly adult populations, although there's concern now that our next generation might not see monarch butterflies anymore. There's two main populations of monarch butterflies. We have one out of the west coast of the U.S., this Californian population, and we have this other population that's out of Mexico. And essentially, why I'm calling these two separate populations is because they're quite distinct. You can see this right here, the Rocky Mountains, that actually separates these two populations, so they don't actually intermingle. And it's very interesting how they migrate such far distances. So every single year, these monarch butterflies down here in Mexico, they fly north. They keep laying eggs and keep flying further north and laying eggs, so on and so forth, until they get to the southern part of Canada. When it starts to get cold, which in Canada is, I don't know, probably around very early, it starts to get very cold, and they start moving on down, September or so, they start flying on down. And these adult monarch butterflies actually fly. They're overwintering ones, okay? They're the migratory monarch butterflies. Will actually fly all the way from southern Canada all the way down to Mexico. A single flight, okay? These single generation will fly all the way down. They will survive the winter on those trees in Mexico. And when it's springtime again, they are the ones that make the flight up. So this single generation makes this incredibly long, several thousand-mile flight across Canada, across U.S., and down into Mexico. And there's this California population, doesn't travel quite as far, but a similar idea where they will actually overwinter, survive the winter over the west coast of the U.S. Now, there are some concerns that this population here, this west coast of North America population, might actually go extinct. Their populations have dwindled substantially, and there are concerns about whether they'll actually be able to recover or if they're on an inevitable decline to extinction. So only time at this point will tell. And here you can see these trees are the trees in Mexico that these monarch butterflies migrate on. And they're supposed to have green leaves, but it looks fully orange. And the reason is because it's covered in monarch butterflies. So it's apparently quite a sight, a very protected piece of land there. So it's not very easy to just go visit. I'm not sure what's involved, but it is a very protected area there. Now we have a number of different native pollinators as well. So monarch butterflies are obviously, they are considered native, but we do have some other ones here in Texas that we can encourage their populations of. This one is known as the giant swallowtail. Right, and you've probably all seen this one, a beautiful black butterfly with yellow on it. And it feeds, its caterpillar, the immature, feeds on citrus plants. And let's see if any of y'all have a thought in terms of what that caterpillar looks like on that right side. That's right. If you guessed it looks like a bird turd, you're accurate. So on the right side there, you'll see this caterpillar that looks like bird turd, and it's thought that the reason why is to avoid predation. So if you look like the bird's feces, you're less likely to be eaten by the bird itself. So this is an excellent example of a type of mimicry we refer to. The eastern tiger swallowtail, you'll see the caterpillar there in the top right. Very similar. Again, does not look very appetizing, especially if you're a bird. And their caterpillars feed on several different host plant families, such as catalpa, laurel family, olive family, willow family, storax, and rose family. You'll see here in the bottom left, the adult is predominantly yellow with some black in it as well. We have the black swallowtail. Here you'll see in the bottom left that adult is kind of black with some fluorescing blue along the bottom edge. And their caterpillars feed on fennel, dill, and parsley. The pipevine swallowtail. All right, so you'll notice there in the bottom left, those caterpillars have these little short yellow spines. And again, this might be some type of coloration or morphology, that is these physical features that essentially ward off potential predators. We have milkweed plants for our monarch, soldier, and queen butterflies, right? So we got the whole royal family there. So if you're rearing or you're producing some milkweed plants, you could be promoting populations of multiple different butterflies that are all kind of closely related, look very similar. So you'll see the monarch butterfly there on the far left with its caterpillar has these 4 protrusions, right? Two near the front and 2 near the back, where you start looking at some other caterpillar species. So there on the top right, you'll see there are 6 protrusions. There's this extra set near the front, kind of the front half of the body. And they're kind of named based on the sizes of their chrysalis. So you'll see the monarch butterfly there in the very middle. It's quite a bit larger than the soldier and the queen butterfly chrysalis. We have the Mexican yellow. So there in the top left is the butterfly. That's this beautiful yellow color. The caterpillar there in the bottom left can look a little bit like a beet armyworm. So if we're not careful, you might think that some of these caterpillars, again, are a lot more damaging than they actually are. We might try and control them instead of just letting them feed a little bit and become these beautiful adults. And they feed on the legume family, Acacia and Diphysa. So catclaw acacia and black locust. We have Serranus blue, and they will feed on legume family, so Texas ebony, honey mesquite, and fern acacia. And you'll see this beautiful blue butterfly. And in the very top left, you can see the caterpillar is this very interesting, very kind of distinct shaped type of green caterpillar. We get a similar type of caterpillar here with the Reichert's blue. You can see in the top left there's the actual adult, and right to the right of that is the caterpillar. Again, it almost looks kind of ribbed and predominantly green. And again, feeds on legume family, white clover, catclaw acacia, yellow sweet clover, indigo bush, and honey mesquite. We have bordered patch. You'll notice the caterpillar on the top left there looks kind of spiny, perhaps again a little bit dangerous to handle. And you can see the butterfly there in the pane just to the bottom right of it. And it feeds, the immatures feed on the sunflower family. So sunflower also feed on ragweed, cockler blur, cowpen daisy, and Indian blanket. We have the Texan crescent, right? So it feeds on acanthus family, false mint, Carolina wild petunia, hairy tube tongue. And again, you'll see that the caterpillar looks very similar to the previous one we looked at, in that it looks like it could cause some damage if you were to handle it, but it's actually not all that harmful. We have also the pearl crescent. They feed on sunflower family, Texas aster, tall willow aster, and white aster. We have the painted lady. There's in the very top left is the actual butterfly, and to the pane to the very right is the caterpillar, and feeds on many different host plants. So if you're looking for the most bang for your buck, you might want to find something that some type of a host plant that has many caterpillars that feed on it. So you'll notice there in the top right the sunflower family that already had at least one other pollinator that feeds on there. Board family, goosefoot family, legume family again, mint family, mallow family, plantain, buckthorn, nettle, and verbena. So we have a very wide host range for this particular caterpillar. We also have the common buckeye. Again, on the very top left, you'll see that it looks like eyes on that actual butterfly wings. And we have the caterpillar on the pane to the very right of it. Feeds on acanthus family, stonecrop family, figwort family, and verbena. So such as foxglove, Texas verbena, common wild petunia, Texas paintbrush, yellow stonecrop, German's wild petunia, and snapdragon vine. All right, now we're going on to Hymenoptera. Hymenoptera include our bees, wasps, and ants. These are considered some of the most important pollinators because of their abundance and their efficiency. So we'll see a little bit about that later on. We've also domesticated them for pollination services, which has also been very important for increasing a lot of our crop yields. They are of great economic value. So because of their pollination services, but also production of honey, production of wax, production of and selling of bees, bee boxes, and apiary-related supplies. So there's an entire industry around the selling and using of bees. There isn't an entire industry around, say, the selling and using of monarch butterflies. So there's less of a monetary and or economic value associated with monarch butterflies, even though they may be still incredibly important in our ecosystem and thus indirectly important for some economic value. So the poster child in this is the honeybee, right? And a lot of people show a lot of concern about the honeybee, and in many ways rightfully so. It is because of the honeybee that we've been able to greatly increase a lot of our crop yields. But a word about honeybees, and this is something that kind of irks me a little bit, and the fact that we've made it this poster child, is because it's not actually native to North America. It was actually introduced to North America by European settlers in the 1600s, and it is a domesticated bee, so there's nothing native about it. If they all died, our ecosystems would not collapse. Things would still be fine. We would lose a lot of crop yields because it's due to their efficiency and their use that we've been able to drastically increase crop yields and in some cases even have certain crops that are not native to this region. So honeybees are considered the most efficient pollinators. And some of the reasons include their colony size, so they can have thousands of individuals within a single colony, and so they need a lot of food. So as such, you have them visiting a lot of flowers. When they're visiting those flowers, they'll be transferring pollen between them, thereby being excellent pollinators. And they use that pollen as protein for their babies and the nectar as a carbohydrate source that becomes honey that we then use. It's stored carbohydrates. Now, there is a very long history of domestication for honeybees. Here we can see some very old Egyptian drawings from, BC of domestication of honeybees, of them pouring honey, and you can see on the right there what appear to be to be bees. And they produce honey, they produce wax, and provide pollination services. And that's also a very critical one that a lot of people oftentimes don't think about. So honeybees aren't important just for honey or for their wax, but one of the main values is for their pollination services. So people actually selling and shipping their bee colonies to different regions of the U.S. in order to pollinate those crops. So see here on the far right side is the percent pollinated by honeybees of different crops. So for soybeans, it's 50% pollinated by honeybees. Alfalfa, 60%. Cotton, 80%. Almonds, 100%. Apples, 90%. Oranges, 90%. So on and so forth. So without honeybees, it's not to say that we would completely lose all of our yields or completely lose all of our crops. There are certain crops, such as almonds, that rely specifically on honeybees that would lose all the yields. There's other commodities such as apples or oranges that without honeybees would drastically reduce the yield that we'd be getting off of those plants. So almonds, every single year, about 2/3 of all the U.S. bee colonies in the U.S. get transported over to California to the almond groves. It's about 2 beehives per acre that they need in order to get the yields that they need for almonds. So something to think about next time you're having your almond milk. There's these poor bees being slaved around the country to produce those almonds. And so, a lot of times people will say, if we die, we're taking you with us. People will say. The bees will say this. If you're listening to the bees, are you listening to the bees? Right? They'll say, if we die, you're taking you with us. But it's not entirely true, right? So again, if the bees die, it would greatly reduce yields of a lot of commodities that we really like, would greatly impact our economics. But we would survive, especially, again, they're not native to here. So there was a time when we didn't have honeybees in North America. Now, what makes things very interesting or challenging with honeybees is that they have very intricate behavior that makes it difficult to know what impact, say, an insecticide has on a honeybee. Right, it's one thing if it doesn't kill the honeybee and you say, oh, it doesn't kill it, then it's fine. It's another thing to know if it impacts some of their intricate behaviors and how, as a result, that would impact the colony health. So as an example, honeybees do this. It's known as the bee dance, and it's used to communicate sources of nectar to their sisters in the colony. So a little scout honeybee will go out and find a source of nectar, comes back to the beehive, and starts doing this little dance. So she'll go in a circle, and then she'll wiggle, 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 go back in a little half circle, do a wiggle, 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 and all the other honeybees that are nearby will stop and watch her. And the intensity of that wiggle tells all the other bees how far that source of nectar is. So if it's, in terms of the frequency, is a certain frequency, then it tells them, say, 1 kilometer away. Now, the direction in which she does that bee dance within the hive, right, it's the direction relative to the sun. So they actually have polarized lenses, and they can see essentially polarization in the sky. They can see which way is north, south, so on and so forth. And so they can actually determine, based on the direction that she's doing the dance, what is the relative angle of that nectar source from the beehive. So they'll all watch her do this bee dance, and then they'll do that bee dance with her, and then they'll all go out to that nectar source. So again, incredibly intricate behavior. So how do we know? So for example, it's very difficult to study the impact of an insecticide or even a fungicide or anything that's sprayed on their ability to do a bee dance. Because if it affects their ability to do a bee dance, you can imagine that drastically impacts their ability to find sources of nectar successfully. So it's very important for the hive's functioning. Now, in 2006, there was this phenomenon that was named colony collapse disorder, which made people very concerned about honeybees and pollinators. It was referred to as a serious problem threatening the health of honeybees and the economic stability of commercial beekeeping and pollination operations in the United States. So here specifically, it says the economic stability of commercial beekeeping and pollination operations. I want to bring that to the front here, because when we're talking about honeybees and them being a domesticated bee, when we are thinking about their decline or their hives not doing so well, we're not so worried about the ecosystem. We're not so worried about broader impacts, because in this case, it is a business of a domesticated bee. They can be reproduced. Colonies can be split and colonies increased, but it comes at a cost to the beekeeper. So essentially, when honeybees are in trouble, it means that our bee industry is in trouble. Now, the other question is, how is that impacting our native bees? And that's what we really want to look at in terms of, what is the ecological impact. But now, bringing it back to the colony collapse disorder, what they saw was, every single year, a beekeeper would expect about 10 to 15% of their hives to die. Whether it be lack of resources, there are a weak colony, maybe a weak queen inside that colony. It was kind of expected. If you had 100 hives, you would lose about 10 of those over the winter. Now, all of a sudden, in 2006, some beekeepers reported 30 to even 90% hive loss. And there was a very specific set of symptoms associated with colony collapse disorder. This is also very important to note. What they find was basically abandoned hives. So there was adults were just completely missing. There was capped brood, so the young, the basically vulnerable young larvae are still in there. There is presence of food stores, there's plenty of food, and there's presence of the queen bee. The queen bee is there. So basically just all the workers are gone. They've just kind of disappeared. And so again, here's that, I was mentioning back in 2006 and 7, it was expected, the acceptable loss of colony percent total colony winter loss is about 15%. This is looking year after year of the number of colonies lost. Whereas some beekeepers are reporting, on average, it was about 32%, 35%, so on and so forth. So you'll notice those numbers remained quite a bit high after 2006. We also see here that the number of honey-producing bee colonies, right, ever since 1950, now this is the kind of interesting thing, is ever since 1950, was on a steady decrease. So it doesn't mean that our honeybees were in trouble already at that point, right? So that's why it's kind of important to look at a broad picture of what it's all happening. we had less hives, there was maybe less demand, or the hives that we had were actually just more efficient, were great at producing. So now instead of having 100 very small hives, a beekeeper might have 50 larger hives, so they can do a lot more with them. But you'll notice that in 1982, just after 1982, actually, we had this parasitic mite introduced into the U.S. This is a mite of the honeybee, known as the varroa mite. Imagine a parasite the size of like a dinner plate on your back. Okay, and that's basically what these parasites were. And what made them the most, very dangerous to honeybees is that they can vector certain viruses and pathogens of honeybees. And so they can very quickly cause these honeybee colonies to essentially collapse. Now, it wasn't necessarily calling a collapse disorder, but it can cause those colonies to die off. So you'll notice, right, during that time, there's between 1982 and 87, there's all of a sudden a sharp decrease in the number of honey-producing bee colonies. And then it starts to kind of level off, even just as about when we hit colony collapse disorder. You'll also notice this nice little trend here. This is the U.S. honey production in the millions of pounds. So again, remember I showed you there was like a general decline in the number of honeybee colonies we have in the U.S. over time, but the amount of honey production in the millions of pounds remains relatively consistent, right? Since 1990 all the way to 2012, you can see it decreases a little bit, but on average, it actually, you don't see a massive decline. So again, not only do we have colonies that are perhaps producing more honey per colony, but we also have is beekeepers are able to replace their beehives that are dying. So even though they're getting 30 to 90% loss, they can buy new colonies, they can split their old colonies and all of a sudden get them back. But that's at a major cost to the beekeeper. So essentially it's making beekeeping less profitable and thus less viable as an industry. So now they've always, discussed what are the potential causes of colony collapse disorder. So this includes things like pathogens. So there's a number of new pathogens, essentially bee diseases that were introduced that could potentially kill the bees. Parasites. So you can see here, this is the varroa mite on the back of a honeybee. We have management stressors. So I mentioned 2/3 of those bee colonies get transported all the way to California every single year just for the almonds. And you may have sometimes seen something like this. If you haven't seen it yet, just pay attention. You'll probably notice it. Of stacks of bee colonies basically being transported across the country. And this is considered quite stressful for the bees. So it's not considered ideal, but it is considered quite profitable. So that's why it is still done. And we do have environmental stressors, so whether that be lack of pollen or nectar sources. So we've gotten very effective at managing our weeds. We've gotten very effective at, in certain landscapes, having a monocrop, just one type of crop that might have a source of nectar or pollen within a 1 or 2 week window, and that's it. So these are not considered very beneficial environments for a lot of these pollinators. And lastly, we have pesticides. So some have also implicated pesticides as a reason for decline in honeybees. So if pesticides are not being used the way they are meant to be used, you're applying directly on the honeybees. In some cases, they even think, there's some studies that say that even used as per how the insecticide label says you can use it, it can still harm these pollinators. So there's still a lot of work being done in that area as well. However, I want to focus a little bit more now on some of the native bees. All right, so we have thousands of native bees that are not considered to be of such great economic value as our honeybees, but can be just as important depending on the crop. And because we're not tracking them as much, there's not an industry around them, we don't have as good records of what their population's doing, and we don't have a really good way of greatly increasing their populations again. So if we have 90% loss of a certain wild pollinator 1 year, we don't have a way of quickly reproducing and to recover that the next year. So these include plaster beetles, leafcutter bees, mason bees, wool carder bees, digger bees, so on and so forth. And they are considered better at pollinating native plants such as pumpkins, cherries, blueberries, and cranberries, tomatoes, and eggplants compared to honeybees. So again, these native bees are actually just as important for some of these native plants and pollinating them. And so here you can see this beautiful kind of diversity that you see in native pollinating bees. There are 46 species of bumblebees in North America. They are honey producers, but not quite enough to harvest. And you can see there along the bottom is a series of different species of of bumblebees, and you can actually distinguish different species by the pattern of yellow to black on their bodies. So one example are bumblebees that are ground nesting. The nest is initiated by an overwintering queen, and you see in the spring looking for a home. And the queen raises and feeds first set of babies, and then the workers from there take over the activity in that colony. Depending on who I'm talking to, I consider this a pretty friendly type of pollinator. Let me see a quick show of hands. How many of you here are master gardeners? How many of you here are landscapers? Okay, how many of you here have some kind of forage or do some kind of turf growing or something like that? Show of hands. Okay. Again, this is a pre-recorded video, so if you just put your hand up, again, I can't see nothing, so I don't know. If you did raise your hand, I don't know why you raised it. I mean, this is a video, but anyways, depending on who I'm talking to, right? If someone who works in the forage, I tell them these bees are aggressive. If it's like a homeowner, they're not aggressive. And the reason is because if you ever run over these things with a large mower in a field, they will come after you. Otherwise, they're considered pretty friendly. They won't attack you unless you ride over them with a sharp blade spinning at a very fast speed. Other than that, they're pretty friendly. And we do have, within bumblebees, we have a specific species that's already been considered endangered. This is the first U.S. bumblebee to be listed on endangered species list. This is the rusty patch bumblebee. All right, so in terms of their conservation, again, they're excellent pollinators and worth conserving. They're found wherever plants flower, forage during unfavorable weather as well, which makes them quite nice. They go for a variety of flowering plants throughout the year. And some of their nesting habitats include uncultivated land or hedgerows and old tree stumps. We have leaf-cutting bees, aptly named, as you can see here in the top right. This bee is cutting this almost like this perfect little circle it's going to use to essentially cap off its little nests. So they make these cylindrical nests that they then plug with these circular little leaf discs. And there's an introduced species that's very important to alfalfa pollination in the West. We have mason bees, all right, so they carry pollen on their belly, which is kind of fun. It's this very vibrant yellow color you see on the bottom right, just full of pollen. They are solitary bees, and they like company, again, are kind of friendly to other insects and friendly to people. They use clay or mud to seal up homes. So that's something to consider there. There needs to be a source of clay or mud nearby for them to be able to nest. Otherwise, it's not considered a very favorable habitat for them. They basically emerge early in the spring, and that's when they mate. They gather their favorite food, which is fruit pollen and nectar, and they knead that into a little ball. They lay an egg on top of these food balls and seal up the cell, and then they repeat. There's the blue orchard mason bee. All right, extremely efficient at pollinating fruit trees, and it's a managed bee for some agricultural purposes. So similar to honeybees, there are some bumblebees that are actually domesticated or managed as well. And you'll see here in the bottom left that someone has drilled several holes of different diameters because depending on the bumblebee species, they like different size holes for nesting. So here, this type of bee likes 3/4 inch centers for their holes, 6 to 8 inches deep. And so some people actually go so far as to make mason bee homes. I think it was downtown Austin, or maybe it was downtown Fort Worth, that I recall actually seeing some of these types of houses, a little sign saying, do not disturb, that this is a bee home. So they're kind of neat little hobby. If you want to encourage pollinators, you can look into, there's a number of different instructionals online on how to make different size holes to encourage different types of bees, so on and so forth. We have the carpenter bee. All right, this one is very neat. As they call it a shiny hiney. Okay, so it's a little bit shiny. Build nests in stems and solid wood. They do what's called this buzz pollination. All right, so if you ever remember, maybe in music class you learned about resonance, right? So if you have a little key that you hit on a table of a specific note, and you have another key, that same note, and you hold it close to it, and the sound vibrations from the one will actually make the other one vibrate. And it's because they have the exact same frequency of vibration. And so these bumblebees actually do that exact same thing. They know that there's certain species of flowers that pollen will only shake off at a specific type of frequency. And again, very similar to the depth of the flower being, the depth of the nectar being different for some butterflies, so that they can encourage that butterfly to pollinate their own species. The same type of thing happens with this carpenter bee, that by this carpenter bee having this relationship with the plant to know exactly how to vibrate off that pollen, it is essentially creating a relationship so that it can help encourage its own species to be pollinated with higher success. So here's kind of on the very bottom, we see different species of plants, and depending on the plant the honeybee is on, sorry, my mouse is not showing up on the screen right now, so I can't kind of highlight, but depending on the plant that it's on, it'll vibrate at a different frequency and for a different length of time. So how can we encourage native bees? So some native bees may be in decline. Again, we don't know about all the native bees because there's not a huge economy around them, so we don't track them nearly as closely. And there might be a range reduction, so perhaps planting more pollen or nectar gardens. Avoid pesticides when native bees are active and apply before dawn and at sundown. We want to water in a mud source, plant native plants, and provide nesting habitats, such as bee houses, dead stumps, native grasses, plants, and shrubs instead of manicured lawn. Now we're going on to Diptera. These are things like our houseflies, fruit flies, fungus gnats, mosquitoes, hoverflies, and syrphid flies. That's right, mosquitoes. Excellent pollinators. So encourage mosquito population. I'm just kidding. No, they're not. I'm just saying mosquitoes are in this group, Diptera. Raise your hand if you like mosquitoes. I'm kidding. Don't raise your hand. All right. Some act as pollinators. They can be strong agricultural pests or human pests, such as mosquitoes. We have leaf miners and fruit flies, which are major agricultural pests. And some are actually considered predators. So some are considered not only pollinators as adults, but as immatures, as we'll see here in a moment, some are considered excellent predators. So here's one. This one is known as a syrphid fly or a hoverfly. It looks a lot like a honeybee, so you would do nothing to hurt it anyway because you think it's a honeybee, and as an adult, pardon me. As an adult, this fly is essentially not a very strong pollinator, but is a bit of a pollinator. But the immatures, so what these adults do is they lay their eggs next to other soft-bodied insects. So here you can see these little white eggs right next to these aphids. Right? So aphids are considered a major pest of a lot of garden plants or agricultural plants. And those eggs emerge, and out comes this little larva. Here's this larva, and it's actually feeding on an aphid and sucking it dry. So they are considered excellent predators of other insects. Mosquito, yeah, we love mosquitoes. Male mosquitoes can be considered a bit of a pollinator. So male mosquitoes do feed on nectar because they just need a source of energy. The females are the ones that suck blood because they need a source of protein in order to make the babies. So the males do not actually suck blood at all. We have this tachinid fly, and as you can see from all those hairs on it, naturally we'll be picking up some pollen as it goes to visit some flowers and pick up some nectar. Next, Coleoptera are beetles, right? So here's this poor little beetle in the top right that looks like it was just doused in pollen. So some are considered major agricultural pests, and others are considered predators of pest insects. So we have a number of potentially pollinating beetles in this group, such as soldier beetles, locust borer, and blister beetles. And then lastly, going on to Neuroptera. These are our lacewings, mantid flies, and antlions. And so the adult green lacewing is considered nocturnal. The adults typically feed on nectar, and pollen. And the larvae are predators. They are not considered very strong pollinators, but have been observed carrying some pollen. The reason I introduce this group is not because they are excellent pollinators, but because they're just a really cool group. They can act as pollinators, and they can also act as excellent predators. So they're excellent to also encourage their populations around in the garden. If you've ever seen something like this, these are eggs laid on a single thread, and these are the eggs of lacewings. And so here's a green lacewing adult. They are nocturnal, so if you've ever left your lights on at night, you will see these adults come into that light. And here's an example of one of the larvae. So this is its immature under a bunch of debris. So some species will actually stack all this debris onto their back, the carcasses of their old enemies and their old food, and they essentially use this as a disguise. So if you ever see a little speck of dirt that looks like it's crawling around, there's one of two explanations. Either one, it's this larva under this debris, or two, you're losing your mind. So you might want to go get that checked out. So here's an example of a larva eating an aphid. You can see it has these two mandible parts, two pincers that it sticks inside the aphid. It injects digestive fluid and then sucks it dry. So excellent predators and excellent for inducing nightmares. And here's what is known as a mantid fly. These ones are very neat because you'll see the bottom half of the body looks a lot like a green lacewing, whereas the top half looks a lot like a praying mantis. So it is kind of this crazy fusion between the two. It is considered a predator and also a weak pollinator. So here, sorry, again, I can't really move my mouse, so it's hard to point out, but essentially what they found was that they can find some pollen on top of the mantispid or the mantid fly, but the honeybees always consistently carried more. So it's not that they are nearly as good as honeybees, but they are very cool. So there you have it, the 5 different groups of pollinators that we just went through. That's Lepidoptera, Hymenoptera, Diptera, Coleoptera, and Neuroptera. However, the question is, how about pesticides, right? So a lot of us, might have a pest that we want to manage. And again, as long as it is not a caterpillar, that's going to become a pollinator, you might consider how can you manage it? So, there are some studies, for example, that have shown pesticide exposure in honeybees results in increased levels of gut pathogen nosema. So you're like, what does that mean? Well, similar to us, right? These bees have a little community of bacteria in their gut, right? So when you have like probiotic yogurt and you're trying to encourage that gut bacteria, these bees have a community of bacteria as well. And some are good and some are bad. So depending on what that balance is. And so what they've found is, depending on the pesticide, some of that exposure can result in some of the bad bacteria becoming more abundant. And so, again, some of these very highly sophisticated kind of relationships between pesticide use and pollinators. There's also been some studies that show that neonicotinoids, as a class of insecticides, which includes thiacloprid, imidacloprid, and clothianidin, when used at field realistic rates, can actually impact the immune system of these honeybees. Again, so that means that if this honeybee is exposed to pathogens and you've now also sprayed some kind of neonicotinoid, you might be really impacting pollinator health. And let's just go on here. So pollinators and pesticide use. So we always want to look at things that are low residual, high specificity, And it's important to note that natural is not always better, all right? And one of the important things you want to look at is the bee advisory box. So there's this new box that's required to be on the label that essentially tell you about the potential impact on bees and or pollinators. So if you see a pesticide label that has this many pests on it, right, that's not considered high specificity. So the more pests it has labeled on that label, the more likely it is that it's going to actually also target non-target organisms such as pollinators. So you want something that's going to be a little bit more specific to your target pest. And there's your bee advisory box, is what it's going to look like. On the right side, you'll see this. The new bee icon helps signal the pesticide's potential hazard to bees. You always want to follow good IPM practices or integrated pest management. So you'll see at the very base of this pyramid is monitoring and scouting. It's very important to know what is your pest and is it abundant enough to really merit some kind of control measure. Right? And could you manage it by just weeding out a particular plant and bagging it and getting rid of it? By using just good, better cultural and sanitation practices? Could you try and exclude them, the pests, from getting in there in the first place? If not, then you want to, your last resort is essentially the pesticides. UC IPM also has a great resource where you can look up the active ingredient on an insecticide, so in this case, azadirachtin, and it'll tell you about the impact on water quality, natural enemies, honeybees, and also looking at people and other mammal impact as well. So azadirachtin on water quality, medium, natural enemies, low to medium, so very, very low toxicity to non-target organisms. Honeybees also medium. And you can look at a bunch of them. So for example, if we're looking at just honeybees, azadirachtin is medium, where something like dinotefuran, if you apply it directly to the honeybees, is considered very high in terms of toxicity. So again, that's something you'd want to avoid spraying if you're trying to protect your pollinators. A couple field guides that I'd recommend. Coffin Field Guide to Butterflies of North America. It's not a major investment to get the paperback, and excellent for recognizing pollinators in the backyard. We have another one for just insects of North America as well. And here's actually a good friend, Whitney Cranshaw, is an author of this book here, Garden Insects of North America. It's actually a very thick, hefty book, and I'm surprised that they can actually even sell it for $24. And that's, again, an excellent resource for recognizing insects in the garden. Lastly, this kind of neat Million Pollinator Gardens kind of challenge. You can go to this website and become a part of this larger program to encourage pollinators around the country. There's a number of ways that you can get involved. And, there is the USDA as well, has some excellent resources for insects and pollinators, the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And that is all. At this point, I will take any questions via email. Feel free to email me if you have any questions or any comments. Thank you so much for your time and your attention.